This is Taking Stock, and we're inside the cockpit of a Boeing 737-400 simulator at Comair's training center just next door to OR Tambo International Airport. Eric Venter is the chief executive of Comair, listed airline company in South Africa that's been profitable for 72 years, in sharp contrast to its national carrier rival SAA, which hasn't made much profit for a very, very long time. In fact, it's bankrupt. If it was in the real world without a state subsidy, it wouldn't be able to take off. Very few airlines, Eric Venter. I mean, do any airlines make money out of flying passengers, which is the core business of the airline?
It's very uncommon these days for airlines to actually make money out of flying passengers. Even Comair, if you're an efficient passenger and you book online and you arrive for the flight that you originally booked for, you don't change your tickets, you don't make any amendments, we make no profit. You fly at a zero profit margin for us. So all of our profit is made from those passengers who carry excess baggage, who change their flights, who buy ancillaries like booking a specific seat. All of that is where the profit comes from. Fortunately, we still actually make profit from that. There are airlines out there that don't even make a profit after that. They make profit from things that go way beyond it. So some of the airlines that have been noteworthy in terms of profitability over the years have been the likes of Southwest Airlines. Now, Southwest, if one goes back in history, you found that most of their profit came from fuel hedging. And the interesting thing is,
you're taking bets on what the fuel price is going to do, which is what SAA did.
But if you track Southwest's fuel hedging, they take massive fuel hedges just before the US went into a Middle East war. Now, that's an interesting coincidence, but yes, it is interesting. If you look at the likes of Allegiant Air, also extremely profitable in the US, their entire model is built around selling packages to pensioners to fly to Florida and to fly to Vegas. So that's where they make their money, not from flying the passengers. You look at Ryanair, makes most of its profit from retail concession agreements at the airports that they fly to, which is why they don't fly to the main airports. They go to an external airport far out of the centers, and they sign a retail agreement with all the tenants in that airport, that Ryanair gets a share of the retail revenue from that airport. And so it goes, and you look at the likes of Air Canada, it's made all his money out of his loyalty program and not out of flying passengers. So flying passengers these days has just become a diminishing margin business. And if you don't find something to tag onto it, you're unlikely to actually stay profitable.
Which is why you're doing the IT development, and you're doing the catering, and you're doing the training of staff both on the ground and in the air, as you would do in the simulator, in addition to flying the passengers. And that's perhaps why Warren Buffett was so keen on the Wright Flyer being shot down at Kitty Hawk.
Exactly. But in America, Warren Buffett's investment in US airlines is a different story again, because there we saw about 4 or 5 years ago, all the big carriers in the US cut capacity almost simultaneously by 15%. So there was overcapacity in that market, and the airlines couldn't make money. And then somehow, without any collusion, they all cut their capacity, and all of a sudden they all became profitable. And then they all could put their fares up, and they became more profitable.
Without collusion, sarcastically?
Well, they had an investigation, and they found no collusion. They just all happened to decide to cut capacity.
After the same game of golf, the same golf club, possibly.
Well, who knows?
But in South Africa, I mean, we have a very robust, from a consumer perspective, airline industry. I mean, you have had a dozen competitors come and go over the last decade or so. Lots of people have liked the idea of running airlines and have failed to do so. It suggests that this competition here is quite vigorous.
It's very vigorous competition, very difficult to stay sustainable, because you do have to make adequate cash flow to reinvest into new aircraft to raise your efficiency to stay in the game. So every year we face, on average, about 7.5% cost inflation. 9% cost inflation on average. We only achieve about 1.5% airfare increase every year. So you've actually got to find a model where on average you can take out about 7.5% inflation every single year. And the biggest way to do that is with more efficient aircraft. But if you can't generate the profits to start with, to put into more efficient aircraft, you can never start that cycle.
And your payloads are dropping. I mean, you are trading below, I think the global average passenger numbers, bums on seats, 85%. You're below that.
We're below that. We're sitting on around 82% at the moment.
And I mean, and that 3% margin is significant in terms of paying passengers onto seats.
Yeah, it is. And look, typically we're only looking at around 4 or 5% margin as Comair, as a relatively profitable airline, which equates to, on the average flight of 150 passengers, we're only looking at 4 or 5 passengers that are profit. The other 145 passengers are just covering the cost of operating the flight.
And if 4 or 5 people come late, you don't make profit on that flight.
Exactly.
You've still got to take off.
You've still got to take off and land.
Back. When you talk about aircraft, and recently you took delivery of your first 737-800 MAX, the aircraft that was tragically involved in that Ethiopian airline disaster earlier on this year. You and many other airlines around the world grounded those aircraft. You've suspended the delivery of the second aircraft, which is due by now.
Yes.
And there's 6 more to come. Are you worried about that order? Is there a chance that this thing can't be fixed?
No, look, it's I think it is, to a large extent, it is a new level of technology that's being added to the complexity of flying an aeroplane. And it almost, in a way, it needs to be dumbed down to make it less of a step forward. So I think it's quite a simple fix. I'm not, my personal opinion is that it's not actually such a big step forward that it shouldn't be able to be handled by a well-trained pilot. I would happily fly in the MAX with Comair pilots. But the reality is that there's such massive growth in aviation, particularly in the Far East and in Middle East areas, etc., that the stress on resources, particularly pilots, ground staff, cabin crew, etc., is extreme in terms of developing enough pilots that's fast enough to fly aircraft.
Is there a risk, hypothetically, I don't know if it's real or not, but is there a risk of airlines putting inadequately prepared pilots into the cockpits of airplanes?
There is a real risk. We do training here constantly. We have seen over the last year or so a much higher failure rate of external pilots coming in from other airlines than what we saw historically. So there is this global pressure.
There's a sausage machine.
There's a sausage machine, and as there are these extremely rapidly expanding markets in the Far East, they are struggling to find enough pilots to operate aircraft. So it does mean that if we don't compromise, so sometimes we send people back and we simply say, come back when you're ready. But there really is it's the same, I think, in any industry, where there's the demand for engineers or IT technicians or pilots or whatever else it might be.
If my laptop crashes because the IT technician wired it wrongly,
obviously the consequences are different. Exactly.
If the plane crashes, odds are that something may go horribly wrong, because the global airline industry, the data will tell you that it is the safest mode of transport on the planet.
And so I think even if it came to traveling in a country that has reduced its minimum requirements for pilots, I'd still fly, because you're still safer. If you go to a place like Indonesia or Vietnam or China or many of the other countries that have reduced their minimum flying hours for pilots on jet aircraft, if I was going to go and take a tuk-tuk to go to visit somewhere else in one of those countries, I'd be at far greater risk than flying with a pilot who's had reduced minimum requirements. So it's all relative. And I think the other factor, of course, is that now you've got programs like Air Crash Investigation on Discovery Channel, which just raises the awareness, which puts these things out of proportion in terms of fundamentals.
There are very few serious airline crashes around the world every single year. They
compared to 1.3 million people that die in motor vehicle accidents a year globally, which equates to about 7,300 aircraft crashes a year.
Imagine that.
So in relative terms, it's a very dramatic thing.
You're not pausing on the delivery of the 737-800 because that is part of the modernization?
No,
of your fleet.
it's still a fantastic aircraft. I think in terms of the way that we train our pilots in South Africa, where we've still got very high minimum standards, we still require our pilots to do a lot of manual flying as opposed to simply running an automated system. Whereas in many other parts of the world where there's much more pressure on pilot training, they actually train to run as much as possible in automation because it takes a lot more experience to fly manually. So in South Africa, we've still got a strong pool of pilots in South Africa. We still force pilots to do a lot of manual flying because that's fundamentally, when things go wrong, a pilot has to fly manually. So I think we've still got a very good position in South Africa, as you will find in most established markets in Europe, in the US, etc. So overall, we still think the MAX is an excellent aircraft. They have to probably going to have to make some compromises to make it simpler to fly.
Will they make it cheaper?
It won't make it cheaper.
Nobody ever makes it
Nobody
cheaper.
makes it cheaper. But fundamentally a good aeroplane.
Eric Venter is the Chief Executive of Comair. We'll wrap up with him in just a moment.